Greetings, lords and ladies. It is both my great pleasure and honor to be able to present to you our guest for today, the inimitable, and in some circles, I would argue, infamous Teal'c, Servine slayer of feminist fabrication and prevalent prevarication. Teal'c, welcome.
That is the most fantastic introduction I think I've ever had on anything. Hello, it is an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. I've mentioned this to you privately, but for those of you who don't know, Teal'c, I'm assuming most of you do. If not, he certainly is, I would say, one of the feminist response genre adherents. But I think he produces the best quality videos of all of that, and he also has a lot of things to say about other subjects and related subjects, and that's why we have him here. First and foremost, I think it's important that we address the topic of MGTOW because you had, in fact, made some videos, response videos to a man named, I believe, was it Sexy MGTOW, and a lot of
Indeed.
confusion and conflation had arisen from that. And why don't you, before I put words in your mouth, tell us, tell me, tell the world what you think about men going their own way.
Fundamentally, when you come down to it, I look at sort of the commonalities between what so many of them say, and I think it comes from a very, very good place because the message overarchingly seems to simply be you are the most important person in your life, which is a sentiment I can absolutely agree with. You are the center of your life. You are the constant in your life. You do need to take care of yourself, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever that entails for you. And I think that that is certainly a very, very noble goal and a very good thing to encourage people to do, actually, regardless of their gender, be they male or female. Going sort of onto the specific part of MGTOW, though, the idea of what's the sort of common theme that they have? It's the overarching rejection of marriage, isn't it? Seems to be quite a big one.
Yes.
And that's another one that I certainly look at and say, no, I can completely understand where they're coming from and agree with that because it all you have to do is look at the legal systems in so many Western countries and look at the prevalence of court cases of men getting absolutely screwed over in the cases of divorce and whatnot. And in some cases, men even being hunted down by women, in some cases, years after their divorces, and still having their money forcefully extracted from them. I completely agree that as a contract, that's something that men are better off avoiding and just negotiating their own relationships privately with their partners without getting the state involved.
And it's not then too far flung to say that in the most technical sense of the acronym, you are a man going your own way.
Technically, absolutely. It's just not that I choose to associate myself with the label because of the extremists who I've already spoken out against.
Right, right. We'll come to that in a little bit. Can you first tell us about how you first encountered MGTOW in general, and then how you came across, say, this guy, Sexy MGTOW?
How did I encounter MGTOW initially? That is a very lengthy question. I think it's sort of the same way that I came into the. I don't even want to call it necessarily the anti feminist because that's another label that people apply to me that I still reject. Um, it sort of initially came in several years ago when I just sort of stumbled across some YouTube channels from people like Karen Strawn, Davis Arini, and whatnot. And it kind of just sort of introduced me to what is now termed the red pill philosophy. And I just kind of sort of started watching some of their videos, looking at the sources and saying, well, there's actually a fair amount of truth here. Some points I might not always necessarily agree with the exact conclusion or the method used to get to the conclusion, but there's a lot of good stuff here. And I just sort of started listening to it and started watching some of the more prominent MGTOW commentators, people like Spetsnaz, the psychological cynic, Sam Mann, and just sort of went in from there. And I've just sort of got to know different people from there
Okay. How did
until I
you?
inevitably found people like Barbarossa and yourself as well through those channels.
Okay. And this really extremist guy, Sexy MGTOW, how did you come across him?
Um, his was one which I think actually I didn't sort of stumble upon by accident or come through via recommendation. He was someone that someone actually sort of sent me a link to, a private message, just so saying, well, this some is someone who speaks within the MGTOW community. What do you think? And it was basically just them, some bystander on YouTube saying, well, I found this person. I think they've got a bit of a twisted view on it. Have a look at it. And I did.
Okay. And what exactly was Sexy MGTOW claiming? I think I have a general idea, but obviously not everyone in the audience might know this or know of the event. So,
Yeah, his viewpoint fundamentally went towards basically just an outright statement that women were not human beings and were not capable of being human. And I just sort of looked at this claim and internally laughed out loud. It was just thinking, how can you possibly try and justify that sort of belief, even from an anthropological
yeah,
perspective? It
well,
just
yeah,
makes no sense.
yeah. If women aren't human, if human women aren't human, what are they? Are they equines? Are they both? I mean, what? It's obviously a non-factual claim to begin with, but surely he probably meant more than just the women aren't human in a biological sense, or they're a separate species. He probably meant something else. What exactly was he getting at?
He was getting at the point that he seemed to be digging at this idea that women have some sort of moral deficiency in comparison to men, that men are capable of reaching a higher point at which point they are deemed to be human beings, and that women are sort of incapable of reaching this either emotional or intellectual capacity. Like basically, he seemed to be getting at sort of women cannot have compassion, they cannot have empathy, they are purely sort of selfish beings incapable of looking outside themselves, and that he was sort of putting this into this female nature box over here, and that there is a male nature box over here, and this idea that men can break out of theirs and become MGTOW and learn everything, but no, all women just they stay in their box over there. They're incapable of excelling beyond that. And I just looked at that and thought, what? How do you justify this kind of claim?
No, I didn't pick up on everything that went down in that conversation. But it seems to me that what he was doing was engaging in a sort of over extrapolation from certain things that we do know. I mean, there have been studies, for example, that women show in group preference whilst men do not. In fact, men show the same show out group preference towards women. Women show in group preference towards each other. But moving from that to what he's claiming seems to be inaccurate.
Yeah, that's kind of where I went with it, because there are sort of what I would deem to be almost an undeniable truth about humanity, which is that we do seem to be a gynocentric species, which is something which I have spoken about on my channel. I do believe that there are elements of humanity that are distinctly feminine and elements that are distinctly masculine, and that these are hardwired in certain capacities, which is not to say that we can't override them. It's not to say that men distinctly hit one box, women distinctly hit another, but there are certain leanings from one way to another. But the way that he was going at it, it just seemed way too deterministic for me. It just totally ignored this idea that there are other factors at play here. And he just took it to such an extreme level that I was just a little bit taken aback that someone could have taken the sort of scientific side that I know a lot of MGTOW use and sort of say, well, here is some very good evidence for this, such as the same group preference for females and the lesser same group preference for males, or in fact the proof that males tend to prefer females to other males. I think the term that was coined for it was the so-called "women are wonderful" effect. This idea that we will attribute positive um, words to a woman for no other reason than she is a woman. It was quite literally an experiment that's been repeated many times, just a word list and two pictures, one of a man, one of a woman. Which words do you associate with which person? And men and women both almost universally put all the positives onto the woman and the negatives onto the men.
Yeah, and I've spoken on this topic recently, at least in a related sense, that when you, for example, you have a prominent female scientists of the past, such as Marie Curie, the famous chemist. She somehow becomes an exponent for all women on the planet, sort of a heroine. And surely there are men whose names have been lost to the mist of time who have accomplished similar things. We don't know their names, but they were doing work of similar caliber. And I think it's a sort of another result of what we call this sort of gynocentric worldview, that, especially when a woman accomplishes something significant, say in a scientific field, it is of at least on a perceived level greater merit than what a man does. But for me, I like to go back to the basics. All this goes back to the simple equation of reproduction. Women are a limiting factor in reproduction, and from that we can get all sorts of derivative behaviors. And why do we treat women differently? Why are we more inclined to treat them more kindly, for example, and show more sympathy and compassion, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. There does seem to be a very distinctly biological reason behind that sort of behavior in our species, and it does make sense. It absolutely does.
Yeah, I mean, based on the studies I've seen, up until approximately the agricultural era, so about 12,000 years ago, there was a heavy split between the amount of male, that is Y chromosome, versus mitochondrial DNA contributed to the gene pool. Something that approximately 80% of women prior to the agricultural age had contributed their DNA, and only 40% of men. And I think that speaks volumes. With agriculture setting in, this tends to balance out somewhat, but it just shows an overwhelming tendency, for obvious reasons, limiting factor in reproduction, to favor the female in cases of gene replication.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I think the MGTOW community, or any community, can be guilty of what I like to term as sort of false solidarity, or loyalty just for the sake of loyalty. And I've been accused of this as well. I don't want to talk about this person extensively by any means, but everyone in the MGTOW community knows that I am opposed to the methodology and means of Sandman and how he presents the MGTOW concept. When I first presented this, and even later on, I was internet accosted and told that I just need to stick together with my fellow men, and just in an act of solidarity just support him regardless of whether I agree with him or not. And I think, if anything, if anyone's going to be accused of being just like the feminists, that is a slippery slope, and that's where we start acting just like the feminists. If we just blindly agree with each other because we share genitalia, that is a dangerous precedent, I think.
Absolutely. And that's actually sort of one of the reasons why I was quite enthusiastic to join you on this show, because a lot of people, after seeing me speak out against Sexy MGTOW and a couple of other MGTOW, they've sort of demanded that I come and talk to someone such as yourself or Barbarossa and say, like, oh, go and pull apart what they're saying because they belong to MGTOW and you're clearly anti-MGTOW. It's like, no, I don't oppose the ideology. I oppose one person's interpretation of it. That doesn't mean by default I'm going to disagree with all of them. And certainly not only through this conversation, but some of our previous ones, we found out that actually there's very little disagreement on many things because we both chase as objective a proof as possible.
Right. I think it's safe to say, if you were to assume a label, you might more or less happily assume the label of seeker of knowledge. That's okay.
Pretty much. I what I look for in every issue is as objective a truth as possible. People's feelings be damned, honestly. I want to know what is correct and what is true.
Yeah, and I come from a similar perspective. Now, we do, of course, in the MGTOW community, and even those who are more inclined towards objective views, we do generalize, but I think it's necessary. And let's face it, distinct groups of people create generalizations because they can be studied, and we know that there's an overall trend that, say, Group X does this. It doesn't mean that every individual in Group X engages in this behavior. But when we speak of, say, male and female behavior, the majority of people belonging to each group tend to display this behavior.
Oh,
That
precisely. It's simply acknowledging that there is a prevalence of a type of behavior within a group.
Yeah,
It's never
yeah,
to say that that behavior is always an absolute expression. It is simply to say that the majority will display this behavior or will lean towards this behavior.
yeah. And if you look, for example, at the data regarding divorce, I mean, who initiates divorce? This is across the globe. It's usually somewhere between 65 and 80% of the time. It's women,
Yeah,
and that, of course, there are exceptions. But if you
absolutely.
were going to approach, say, marriage as a concept and as a contract, that is something you should be well aware of because statistically, you could be in a bad place if you decide to agree on that.
Absolutely. I mean, the important thing, and it's one thing which I think a lot of MGTOW overlook in regards to like the marriage contract. They say that, oh, women cause this many divorces. Like, yes, but depending on where you are, only about 40 or 60% of marriages end in a divorce. So you're looking at effectively you are flipping a coin, which is still fairly poor odds, but you do have to look at it and say, well, no, half of the time you're going to be completely okay. Half of the time you are going to marry someone who you are actually in a sort of mutually committed relationship with who feels the same way about you half of the time. I
Well,
would just
you
say that
you
half of the
can
time people make bad decisions.
you can go to the Philippines. It's illegal to divorce there. Yeah,
There you go.
perfectly safe. I mean, I think. Well, this is another interesting. I wouldn't call it a divide, but it's a difference between a lot of individual men going their own way and others. Is that I've been someone who has never in his entire life been interested in marriage as an idea. It just never interested me. Whereas there are
No.
many men, and you probably share that idea or inclination, but there are many men who just kind of look at the odds, particularly in the Anglo sphere, if you will, say the United States, Canada, Britain, and they say that this just isn't worth it. They would have otherwise probably engaged in a marriage contract and replicated their genes, but because of the blockades put in place and the danger, they just say no. But I never was one of these guys. I just why would I ever get married? I was one of
Yeah,
those guys.
I've never seen the point of it. It's partially because, well, there's several reasons why I look at marriage and say it's not for me. First of all, it's because so much of it is a religious affair, and I don't like religion. I look at it and think it's completely irrational. So I look at it and think, why would I engage in a religious ceremony for the sake of it? It makes no point. There's no point to it. There's no sense to it. But then the other half is well, there is a legal side to it, and the legal side is absolutely stacked against me if something bad happened. And I looked at it and I say, well, no, it would be my private relationship with my partner. Why do I want to invite the state into that and give them power to force wealth out of me, or indeed wealth out of my partner if we ended up in a situation where they had more income than me? I wouldn't want to be able to put myself in a position where I could financially cripple someone or be financially crippled myself
Hmm.
because of some sort of private difference that we had. I just think that's a very cruel and unusual thing to do to someone. And why would you put yourself in that position? Your private relationship is your private relationship.
For me, it just comes down to unnecessary obligations. You know, I have one life to
Absolutely.
live, limited time. I'm already, depending on what the gods will, halfway through it. And why spend all that time with nagging, for example, take out the trash, do this, when I just want to do what I want to do. And I think there's one thing that you'll hear often is that men go in their own way tend to be we're selfish because and I know you're anti-natalist, and I really would love to talk about that with you as well. We don't want to we don't want to procreate, which isn't universally true. I don't. We don't want to make our quote unquote contribution to society. uh, I just say, why should I?
Yeah, it's like at what point when you were born were you obliged to pass that on? It makes no rational sense. The default position of a human is to not reproduce. You can't do it by yourself, so why is there a default obligation that you must do this? It's completely irrational.
And moving into that territory, in your Asked Teal Deer Anything, the latest episode, I think, you did briefly address your antinatalism. Do you think you could, for the sake of the audience, expand upon that if you don't mind?
Yeah, fundamentally, when it comes down to what I believe on antinatalism, I just don't think that there is a sort of morally justifiable reason to have a child because it comes down to effectively suffering versus joy. the only thing that you can ever guarantee in life is that someone will suffer in some capacity. Now, you can argue about how much suffering is actually suffering. Is it first world problems suffering, or is it, being born with a sort of congenital bone marrow disease or into poverty and starvation? You know, um, but I look at that and I say, well, consider all of the bad things that you experience in life. You can never guarantee that someone will have a good life or will ever be completely happy. So I look at that and say, well, why would I want to force someone into an existence where I know they are going to suffer or know that they are going to experience bad things and cannot guarantee that they will live a happy and peaceful life?
Yeah. I've stated this in the past. I'm quite sympathetic to antinatalism, but and certainly people who say it's moral to have children. I mean, sometimes they'll offer the argument, well, they having children supports society and blah blah blah. But
That comes from the flawed position that society is inherently correct, though.
well, absolutely. I pointed this out many times. There was a time when the most brilliant minds of the world believed that the sun circled around the Earth. It was not a correct view, despite the seeming fact that the majority of high minds believed that. And also, you know, this is perhaps a MGTOW trait, but I don't seek to harm the rest of the world, but I don't really give a fuck about society. I just want to do my own thing. So
Oh, precisely. Again, that's another reason why, when it comes to not having children, that's my choice. It's like, yeah, it's not through ill will towards society. No, society can absolutely continue on without me, and it's going to.
yeah,
I, you
absolutely.
know, I just I have no ill will or malice towards it. I'm just indifferent to its perpetuation.
Yeah, and I take the same perspective. Of course, we all know why people make tend to make strong arguments towards reproduction. I mean, it's what all organisms do at the end of the day. Most organisms, with the exception of some human beings, we sit around and survive long enough so as to replicate our genes, and the process continues. We're somewhat unique in this regard, but in that we don't do this. Some of us don't do this, and we have the cognitive faculties to not engage in that behavior, even for certain points of time. I mean, the idea of wearing a condom, using birth control to prevent this from happening. Although it's quite not that popular with some of the youth in the UK, as you probably observed.
Oh yes.
But yeah, I'm totally on board with that. But I think if there is any hostility towards MGTOW, a lot of it comes from this sort of we're obliged to do X, Y, Z. In fact, you probably didn't catch on this because this was years back, but the first fissure, if you will, that occurred in the quote unquote manosphere, recent fissure, there probably were earlier ones, was when the what we term traditional conservatives, for lack of a better descriptor, started sort of promulgating ideas along the lines of, you need to reproduce, you need to, find the right woman so you can reproduce, and all along the lines of the sort of duty to man thing and duty to society. And there certainly is from that camp. These people, incidentally, tend to be hostile towards feminism because it
Mm.
doesn't represent their traditional view of the world. But we sort of rejected that, and I pointed this out at the time, and I think that's one of the sources of hostility. But certainly, getting back to the main point, there are people in any community, but certainly in MGTOW as well, who sort of follow the motto, if you're a man going your own way, it doesn't matter what you say, what you believe, and the content you produce. I'm just going to support you regardless. And I can't buy into that. As someone
No,
who
it's absurd.
strives for rationality, and I am completely fallible and make mistakes, and when I make mistakes, I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't want to be part of that because that just defies the core of my belief system.
Yeah, I'm very much of the same mind of that. I will not blindly support someone simply because they share my point of view on some things. If I can find anything and it's like, well, no, you've come to a conclusion over here, and I think your source is faulty or your information is incomplete, I will point it out to them. And I'm quite happy for people to do the same to me.
Yeah, I think it's a rare person um, who actually wants to be corrected, but I do. I want to have as accurate a view of the world as possible. Of course, that's inherently limited. I'm not that smart, and there's only so much I can know. But with the things that interest me, at least, I want to understand what's going on and actually and appreciate it as it is. And I think we're slowly actually moving towards the territory of something we wanted to really get in depth, and I know you did, of forbidden knowledge. And this was actually a video that I had planned and still have planned at some point in time. This idea that there are some things not worthy of knowing because of the possible danger they represent, the risks. And if we look at it, the whole feminist debacle that's ongoing back and forth, a lot of it has to do with that. A lot of it has to do with pointing out things that people just don't want to know. Perhaps feminists, those who are actually legitimate ones, I think they're actual real imposters, like Anita Sarkeesian. I don't believe for a second she believes the trash that she's peddling, but she's able to make a lot of money off of it, so why not?
This is why she never speaks without a script written by good old Macintosh.
Yeah, yeah. But there are ideological feminists who legitimately seem to believe some of the silliness they preach, and I suspect a lot of that has to do with this fear of knowing things or finding out things that might be unpleasant. And this applies to also religion. It applies to some of the most cherished concepts of humankind, such as free will. And I don't want to talk about that now, but I'm just mentioning it. And it applies to differences between sexes and indeed differences between racial groups, distinct ethnic groups that evolved in separate geographical areas. And I see this divide as well in the sciences. I mean, my own audience knows that you can make as much progress as you want in chemistry and physics, but when it comes to the biological sciences, we inevitably have to start talking about human beings, and then boom, there's an obstacle or a blockade. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that the idea of capping any sort of knowledge because it might hurt someone's feelings is absurd. I mean, I know sort of where we're leading into this, when we talk about differences between, say, sexes or races. I mean, the perfect example is the difference between the male and the female brain of our species. There are hundreds of catalogued biological differences between the two that are very observable and um, absolutely universal across our species. They are undeniably there, but some people just say, well, you can't mention that because it'll be used to like justify certain behaviors. It's like, no, we don't look at these things to say, okay, we're going to use this to justify treating people differently. We just have to be aware that there are inherent differences which will push people maybe towards certain behaviors, towards certain wants. Um, if you continue to ignore those differences, some of which might be very important, and I think it means that you will not necessarily then start addressing some problems that can arise because of those differences. I think it's very important that we actually look at them and explore them. And if people object to this idea that there are inherent differences between men and women or between different racial groups that have evolved, as you said, in different areas, so they've become physically different, but somehow the brain is magically shielded somehow from evolution, which is an absurd and laughable idea. It's like, if you find this idea so objectionable, don't silence the people who publish their papers and their methods. No, you take their method, you repeat their experiments, you show why their data was wrong, why their method was wrong, or why their conclusion was inaccurate.
Yeah,
Problem solved.
yeah, but normally this is not the procedure. I mean, specifically with regards to the race stuff, I mentioned this privately. There was a guy, Bruce Lahn, now professor at the University of Chicago, who at the time, it turned out later that it probably isn't the case, but at the time, he certainly discovered gene mutations present in Middle Easterns and Europeans that seemed to somehow correlate with, say, the rise of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, and that didn't rise and did not find any presence in, say, sub-Saharan Africans. And he probably mistakenly jumped the gun and drew certain conclusions. But I was more interested in the reaction to him saying, oh, "You can't continue this. You forget it. Stop the research." They weren't interested in producing counter data or arguing the point or anything like that. And even he went on record, this Bruce Lahn, Dr. Lahn guy, later on saying, well, maybe there's just some things that are not worth knowing because they're just too inflammatory, or we just don't want to deal with this.
Yeah, that's an absurd notion. I mean, I think when it comes down to things like that, you say like, oh, there is a difference in the genetics between these people. Well, yes, we know that already. We can see several very observable differences. But this idea that it might offend some people, like, oh, why did civilization rise in the Middle East and in Europe and in the Far East and not so much in Africa? It's like, well, no, society absolutely exists in Africa. It's just in a very, very different form. Now you have to look at that and say, well, how much of that has been reinforced by previous generations living there? How much of it has been just simply engineered on a decent foundation? Or is there some other aspect to it? Is there some reason why this might happen biologically? Now, again, it's not a case of saying, well, this is inferior or this is superior. Absolutely not. It's simply a case of saying, well, is there a reason why? Can we explain why these trends happen?
Yeah, and I think that unless we can honestly address issues of, say, difference in men and women as well as racial distinctions, we can't even have an honest conversation about it. I mean, this is particularly true for people. I mean, I would argue I'm certainly not a racist, and nor neither are you. Of course, we might be labeled that by certain groups of people just for saying, well, there's a difference between sub-Saharan Africans and
folks. Unfortunately,
people
whether
in
it's
Northeast
on his end or
Asia.
my end, there's a bit
But
of
Yeah, I find it hilarious that
static
people will
instability.
contend that.
I
Like, no,
hope what he was saying prior was intelligible, at least audible. But we were simply talking about, once again, in this specific case, differences between racial groups, and how it's actually fairly obvious that there are differences. But if we do not honestly talk about these things, we can never account for why. And I
mm,
think the best, well, my perspective on this when it comes to women and racial groups or whatever is pretty simple. It's that we want a visible playing field. We don't want to obfuscate and obscure and just pretend that things aren't there that plainly are there. Uh,
mm.
why, for example, in the NBA in the United States, the National Basketball Association, is there an overwhelming majority of black people as opposed to white people? I mean, could that have anything to do with certain racial attributes or properties? And I don't think many people would take issue with saying, yeah, it probably has something to do with that. But when we come down to the mind or the brain, then it's something different, apparently.
Yeah, suddenly it becomes this taboo topic, doesn't it? And I find that very, very unusual. I think I was thinking about this a little bit earlier, and I think it comes down to people have this fear that it's going to be used as some sort of genetic biological determinism. I know this is something that people have accused me of being, and I'm pretty sure you've faced similar accusations that
All the
people will say
time.
that, oh, you're being a, exactly, they say it's like you're being a genetic determinist. You're saying that people are going to do these things because their brain says so and it's unchangeable. So, no, absolutely not. We absolutely acknowledge that culture is a massive influence on what people do, on how they behave, which is why when you control for all sorts of things, poverty obviously being the biggest, but when you control for so many things such as poverty, nutrition, education, performance between different ethnic groups narrows to the point of basically being utterly obliterated. There's such tiny differences. But in an example like the NBA, it's like, no, if your parents are really tall, you will have genes to be really tall. Even if your parents are really short, your genes will dictate that you are really short. No amount of education, no amount of nutrition, no amount of money will change that. It's just not genetically on the cards for you. Now, the idea that the brain is somehow different, I find to be laughable because that is to basically state, first of all, erroneously, that all human brains are identical, which is demonstrably untrue. Take any two people's brains, give them brain scans, pull the things out their heads, cut them up. You will find differences. Absolutely, you will. But it also, with that, the idea that all humans are identical in the mind, it's kind of it means that the human brain must have had a Big Bang moment or a God moment where the modern human brain suddenly popped into existence, and that all brains in our simian species before then were not the same, which it just doesn't follow.
Yeah, but when we talk about culture, I mean, one of my big issues, and certainly in the MGTOW community, is what I believe is a false dichotomy. This idea that we have biology and then we have society, culture, environment, whatever you want to call it, and this is somehow separate rather than derivative of the way we evolved. And so we can talk about them as separate issues, and we can talk about them as separate factors, and I just don't buy into that. And I think we talked about this
Mm,
that society can only be what we as a species evolved to be. We are socially biological creatures, but the structures we have, how we interact, that's all a result of ultimately millions of years of hominid evolution. That's not a separate phenomenon that has nothing to do with what we are as biological creatures.
yeah, I think it's correct. That statement is correct. Like the idea we have, I like to think of it as kind of this idea of society is the bells and whistles of what we are fundamentally programmed to do. We are a social species, undeniably. You do not find humans born and raising themselves. It just doesn't happen. We were social before we were humans because that's how we evolved to survive. And we evolved, obviously, people will argue different reasons for how or different which ways we socially evolved, how our social ancestors behaved. But we seem to have evolved somewhere in between bonobos and chimps, something like that, kind of hierarchical but kind of social at the same time. You can make arguments for either side. It's not really that important, but um, we sort of evolved that behavioral pattern because it was successful to us. And then all we're simply doing with the cultural aspects is refining what was already there. You look around at different clothes, different styles of architecture, different this, different that. It's still based on this fundamental building block that we are inherently social, that we inherently form familial groups.
Right. But and I agree with that. My issue really was particularly with these social constructivists is this idea that certain things which to me are obviously biological in nature have been socialized into us. I mean, this is one the raging debate, and it's not even a debate, at least in scientific circles, that why say men and women are different. You can see differences in toddlers. Simon Baron Cohen, Cambridge researcher on autism, has documented this quite well. And they said, well, she's being socialized to do X, and he's being socialized to do Y, and that's how we get Z. And it just seems to me rather absurd because there is this false dichotomy we have. At least it's understood as a false dichotomy rather than a continuum, which is my view.
Yeah, I would go with that. It's the sort of thing our society has been built, rightly or wrongly. You can make cases either way for the idea that most males will behave in a certain capacity, most females will behave in a certain capacity, or they will lean towards certain behaviors. Now, we don't necessarily discriminate against women who don't follow that, and we don't discriminate against men who don't follow the traditional masculine, but we're sort of built around this idea because we have such a wealth of historical knowledge that people will lean towards these certain behaviors, and it is observable from birth. So it's like, yes, young boys and young girls will lean towards certain behaviors, even when they're babies, when they're infants. And all we do is we simply build on that. That's all we're doing. We're just building on what is already there. As I said, you can make cases whether it's right or wrong that we do that, but that's just what we do.
Yeah, and I've talked about this. I think I'm a somewhat deviant male. I'm not particularly risk happy, and most of the things I've studied, the professions I was teaching, I was translating, they were female dominated. So, and I've never taken offense at someone saying, most STEM maths based professions are occupied by men, and I say, oh wait, but I didn't do that. Does that mean that that's not true? I think a lot of people, particularly feminists and women, have trouble thinking on a macro scale. I recently had a conversation with a woman that I sometimes game with, and I was talking about correlation between height and salary. And she said, "But I know three people, blah blah blah, and don't earn this amount of money." I said, "Well, this has been well studied and exists on a distribution curve. the fact that you may know two or three people that they're on the distribution curve too. But this is, I think, also this essential problem that even after all the data and the general tendencies, we're all stuck with ourselves as individuals, and the general tendency is not going to reduce down to you as an individual. So it's kind of irrelevant at the end of the day. And I think a lot of people then over extrapolate and say, well, they're saying this, and so this applies to me, and maybe it applies to you, but maybe it doesn't. And either way, it doesn't really matter because you are that individual.
It's a very egocentric, absolutist way of thinking. That's one thing I notice about them. Like it's, well, I know an example that disproves this rule, therefore the rule is wrong. Like, well, no. This is why these rules are their guidelines. It's kind of like the majority will display something towards this kind of behavior. That doesn't deny that exceptions exist. It's like,
Yeah.
congratulations, you found the exception. The exception doesn't disprove the rule.
The other aspect of this is something I've talked about with my friend and fellow content producer Coltane, small channel, but he has some good ideas. The idea that if we accept general tendencies, which ultimately go back to some deterministic system, please not to be confused with fatalism. I think that's what you were referencing, that, because most people are like this, we're certainly going to act this way. But we do live in a deterministic universe, and our biology dictates in large measure ultimately what we're going to be interacting with the environment, of course. This idea that, because of that, we won't be able to change certain negative things, negative behaviors in the human species. And speaking on the topic of forbidden knowledge, obviously, certain things that are quote unquote dangerous to know could be and inevitably would be exploited by certain people towards a negative goal or towards reaching a negative consensus amongst people. I mean, I see this, for example, we talked about this previously. There are these groups of people called race realists, and I think that there are observations that there are racial distinctions, and the data tell us, it seems at least, that IQ distinctions that are observable despite socioeconomic class and what have you. Some they do minimize a bit. They draw all sorts of conclusions I wouldn't. I mean, they talk about creating sort of nation states based on ethnicity and what have you. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think again they go to too far of an extreme. I mean, when you remove, I think the sort of thing is, again, they go absolutes rather than what it is, which is a continuum. Like
Yeah.
even when you remove all the sort of socioeconomic factors, the difference, there is sort of a quite distinct hierarchy of things where you do have, like, sort of, say, black average IQ, white European and Middle Eastern IQ, and then East Asian IQ, sort of ranked lowest to highest. But when you remove all the socioeconomic things, the difference at the very peak of the bell curve is something like 5 IQ points. But then they don't seem to acknowledge the rest of the bell curves. Like, they just seem to look at the points and say, that's it. It's absolutely, it's like, no, look at how wide the bell curve is. Look at how expansive it is. Look at the crossover here.
Yeah.
That's the part they seem to ignore. And then this idea that we should divide people up into nation states like that, I look at that and I think, no. At what possible point can you justify this morally? It just doesn't work. If people want to, like, mingle with other people because we are a social species, that is completely their right to. You can't force them not to. But, I'm also someone who, I do like there being variety in the world. I do like there being diversity. I do like the fact that, 10 miles down the road is a very different culture to me. I like even more the fact that 100 miles away is different, that 1,000 miles away is different. But I wouldn't want to force that isolation, nor would I want to go to the other extreme and force people to mingle. I just think that as we've invented things such as the internet, and as we have things like the internal combustion engine and flight and boats and all of this sort of stuff, a mingling of people like that is inevitable, and it will happen gradually over time. But I think to force one outcome or the other is ridiculous. It's a purely organic process that will happen over time.
And thus you find yourself, in some sense, between the two extreme poles, as do I have to say. You have, on the one hand, I would say tendency-wise, this extreme sort of right-wing perspective that actually will talk about, say, differences between races, but then use it to justify all sorts of cockamamie, weird political ideas. And then you
Yeah.
have on the extreme left that the idea that we're all the same and everyone should just get together and sing kumbaya, and they not only should they have to be forced to do so. And I just don't see either spectrum as a particularly good idea.
No, it's a case of it will happen eventually. Just don't force people into a situation where they're not going to want to, and don't force people to do things where they're going to have to exhibit these behaviors. It will happen.
Yeah,
People like to say it's like, oh, it's so racist when you say, oh, but I have a black friend who does this. It's like, no, it's stupid. It's like, no, that is the organic extrapolation of this. This is how it should be happening, because this year it's, well, I have a black friend. Next year it's, well, I have two. In 10 years' time, it's, well, I have 10 of them. This is the organic process by which this stuff happens.
yeah, but of course, left-wing people tend to then point out, say, "Well, you're just saying that to use the black I have a black friend card to somehow disprove that you're, not X." But
Yeah, it's like, yeah, prove that you're not racist because, you have a black friend who you spend time with and enjoy their company. What? How could I possibly hate them irrationally if I really like spending time with them?
yeah, that's definitely the left trend, and on the right end of the spectrum, one of the reasons why their arguments don't resonate with me is this idea. They'll say, for example, the white race is going to be exterminated, or this race, whatever, will be exterminated and go extinct. And that my attitude to that is the same I have to society at large. And fuck, it's got one life to live. Why should I care about any of that?
Yeah.
It just it doesn't really resonate with me. These kinds of tribalistic thoughts, and I think at the end of the day, I don't know if you got around to watching the video I sent you a link to, The Contented Irrationalist, but I do address this idea that for the sake of tribalistic cohesion, people will just display absurd amounts of loyalty to things, even if they're not true, even if they're just insane, just to sort of maintain that cohesion and that feeling of comfort and feeling good. And as much as I'm, for example, a man going my own way, I don't, and I'm loyal to people to the extent that they share interests with me, sure, and they're willing to pursue the truth. But if someone just blatantly says something that's incorrect, I'm not going to support that. Or if I disagree with his methodology, and both on the right and the left, and I guess everywhere in between, you'll see kind of loyalty first, facts and information second. And I I would actually like to see a more of your sort of, well, you're a mainstream guy, more of your sort of mainstream methodology and approach to things, rather than, well, what we have on hand so far. I recently watched a Sargon of Akkad video talking about Muslims and Pakistanis, and some guy in the race realism community had made a response video, and I actually thought the response video, unfortunately, made Sargon look like a fool, because Sargon was going with this left-leaning tendency to say we're all the same. But where do you see? I mean, since you are, I know you don't like labels, but in some sense engaged in anti-feminist activities,
Hmm.
and you, in your methodology and certainly in your view of the world and your role in it, you differentiate yourself from others. People like Sargon of Akkad, Mundane Matt, and just the hoary host of all these feminist response genre types. How do you see yourself there, and how do you see your relationship to the rest of them? Because they are, in some sense, allies, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all sort of go in the same general direction, which is that we oppose the sort of feminist narrative that's being pushed on the grounds that it is factually wrong. But I like to sort of just look purely into the facts. I mean, there was a time when I was a little bit more just sort of ad hominem with what I was doing and just sort of saying, no, this is just stupid because it's stupid. But as sort of time's gone on, I've sort of looked into it and said, no, you know what? I am actually, in some cases, just going to look at their own data, and their own data is wrong. And that's sort of what I want to do now. I've just sort of learned to this, leaning to this point where it's like, no, objective truth is the best thing that you can have on your side. Which is why, again, I don't like to always call myself an anti-feminist and never have. It's a label that people like to put on me, but I mean, that is a label I don't like because it implies that I oppose feminism, which I don't entirely, because there are several videos where I source feminists.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's possible that feminists produce that what is it, intersectionality piece that you sent me. There were actually data there concerning men that appeared to me. I needed to look at it again to be able to be accurate based on the things I've seen in that piece, which doesn't imply that everything they're talking about is actually accurate.
Yeah, I mean, there are some points. I mean, when it comes to things like this idea of intersectionality feminism, which is becoming very big these days, there are some parts of it which are inherently correct and which do use correct data. This idea that men are more inclined to crime, they are more inclined to violence than women. There is sort of some things that are correct here. And again, they are correct in this idea that people do have multiple facets to their personality, some which will give them advantage in society and some which will disadvantage them in society. This part is correct. The problem comes when they use those things, and I think this comes back to what we were talking about using facts to push your agenda. And a perfect example that they would use would be like, if you're really rich, you have an advantage in society. Whereas if you are from an ethnic minority, you may experience disadvantages in society, such as people will treat you differently because of that factor. But then they use this to sort of try and push their own agenda. And there was, you've already seen the document. There was a rather sinister wheel of social change in there where they actually specifically outlined this idea of controlling media messages about people to control how governments represent them. And it's quite a sinister little thing, actually.
Now that we're here, maybe you could explain to the audience, because a lot of my audience, like me, we just kind of do our own thing. We don't spend hordes of time dealing with feminists. Tell us about this intersectionality theory or this series of ideas and the seeming agenda that they have, those who are pushing this.
Intersectionality theory, it's basically something that feminists like to use. Hang on, let me just pull up the document for a second there. It's quite interesting sort of how it began, because it initially began as a means of addressing inadequacies within the legal system. And the term intersectionality came from a metaphor that the person who coined it used to explain it. This idea that a woman is struck at an intersection by a car, and is a woman. Now, the accident is not an accident; it's an intentional sort of hit and run thing. And the court system has two ways of looking at this. They either look at it and say, well, it's because she was a woman, it was a sexist attack, or they say that it was a racist attack. But they were very sort of ill-equipped to combine those two factors and say, well, maybe both of those factors were at play here.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where this term came from. But it's tracked out now to apply to every aspect of society. This idea that all of these different factors are at play constantly, which in some ways I like to look at and say, well, this is basically the study of common sense now. This idea that different people have different factors in their life that operate at different times on different levels, causing them to have advantages or disadvantages. Yeah, okay, I'm absolutely down with that. But the thing that makes it particularly sinister to me is the inherent social justice point that they always put into it. They use this framework of, this fairly common sense framework, which I don't actually see anything particularly unusual about, but they use it to push a narrative that because these things happen, we must change it. And there is a document. Actually, before I go into the document, is there anything you'd like to add in there before I go on to this?
Well, I'm as I said, those I don't deal much with feminists. I tend to ignore them. Maybe I'm arrogant, but I don't think it's worth my time dealing with their bullshit. So no, please continue.
Oh, fair enough. It's a document that anyone can have. It's a document called Intersectionality 101. If you just type that into Google, it'll come up, and it's the first PDF document on the search there. And on page 5 of this document, there is actually a structural wheel, and it's called the intersectional approach model for policy and social change. And this is where things get a little bit sinister with this particular theory of feminism. Um, because it is a wheel in which they basically say that, all of these problems happen because there are these differences. We must now control how people interact with those differences. So it sort of starts by saying, like, oh, we have to control government, we have to control the criminal justice system, public policy, and law. So we have to sort of enact laws that basically say that, no, all of these people are the same, we shouldn't be treating them differently, or we have to give people specific advantages in order to ensure, say, equity in society, which then feeds down into education and media. And this is kind of the big one that a lot of people have been looking at, especially on the anti-feminist side. This idea that feminists are taking over academia, taking over modern academia, which there is some degree of truth to, and that they will then teach people through their own media or through their courses, through their studies, which feeds on to the next step of the wheel, controlling images, controlling negative stereotypes, controlling media. So they educate people to produce media that bigs up the oppressed groups, or bigs up the minority groups, bigs up the groups that have the social disadvantage, while not giving as much time or any particular attention to groups that they deem to be advantaged, which then feeds into the economic side of the wheel, which in theory, when you force people to have those changes, or when you educate them on those differences, it leads to a change in the distribution and access of wealth and resources within our society, changes the distribution of work, because you've now got a bunch of people working who will intentionally employ disadvantaged people or intentionally overlook advantaged people in order to ensure equity, which then feeds back round on the wheel to the level of governance. And it's quite a sinister little model, actually. And I think this is sort of one of those points that a lot of people who talk about intersectionality theory aren't necessarily aware that this is sort of the model behind it. Like, there's the sort of the hypothetical model, which was the thing that I was talking about in the beginning, which is the part I'm actually completely okay with, basically the study of common sense, that money is an advantage, being poor is a disadvantage, etc., etc. But then there's this social justice angle, which inevitably comes with it, which speaks out that there must be social change. And every time I look at this little wheel, the intersectional approach model for policy and social change, I just look at it and think, hi, welcome to 1930s Russia.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really complex issue, far more complex than a lot of people give it credit for. But the reality is, life, nobody has a fairness marker in life. We all start at different stations. We have different genes, different socioeconomic backgrounds, all different sexes, race, etc. I guess I'm a cynical bastard. I recognize all of this. I know it's not fair. It's absolutely not fair. I just don't know there's a whole lot we can do about it. I don't think it's corrigible. And yeah, I mean, it's on the most extreme end, when you're trying to force change down people's throats, metaphorically, you end up with things like gulags and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, you have people who just say, it's not as unfair. I don't agree with that. I think it's, as you said, it's common sense. It's life kind of sucks. It's not fair. There's some people who are poor, have bad genes, and will never get out of that situation. I'm selfish. I'm probably not going to spend time or money helping that person out. But I mean, maybe, I'm just a cynic. That's just the way it is. I don't. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
My problem with it comes from the fact that the lowest common denominator becomes the benchmark. Like, there was an article which is making the rounds on the internet now, quite a big one, about this idea that reading to your children gives them an inherent social advantage, because obviously, you stimulate their minds when they're children. They learn to read faster, they learn to write faster, they get more bonding time with their parents, and that is an advantage that people have, but and therefore people should stop doing it because not everyone has it. And this is again what I find really sinister about this intersectional model for change, about the social justice aspect of it. It becomes this race to the bottom. It becomes the everyone must be this minimum standard. There's no interest necessarily in raising the minimum standard. It's bringing everyone down to that minimum
see.
standard so no one can have an advantage. Whereas I like to look at it the other way and say, well, this is the upper level. Maybe we can pull the minimum standard up as high as possible. But you do have to accept that there is a point where people must be left to their own devices. You can only intervene in other people's lives so far,
Yeah.
because otherwise you do risk going down the extreme communism front. And I don't like using the word Marxism to describe these people. I know it's something that a lot of people do these days, but Marxism fundamentally was only really a structure for economics between class struggle. But these people like to take that term and try and apply it to all sorts of other things. But you can see why people are using that term.
Well, it's funny, I think, that some people, such as Lacey Green, whom you addressed recently, the kinds of the audience she's addressing, I mean, all these people who are social justice warriors and concerned with the quote unquote concerned with the welfare of others. I mean, they're generally not speaking about the poor black male in some American ghetto who had some just really shit luck through no fault of his own. They're talking about middle class women, particularly white women usually, and how they're disadvantaged through apparently beer commercials.
Yeah.
And it's kind of silly because a lot of them aren't even talking about really the most disadvantaged people in our society. They're talking about people who have just plenty of advantages, frankly speaking.
Well, that's why I noticed so many of them never address wealth, because they would lose instantly.
Well, except with the wage gap. Sorry, the wage, and what do they call it? It is still the wage gap, right? The glass ceiling.
Yes, that one, that myth that will just never die.
It never dies. I had to recently discuss once again with the same female that I game with sometimes. I sent her about 4 or 5 good links, well-free research links, where this is debunked, and then she still came up with, but I know someone who works in X office, and she's a woman, and she got exactly. It just it just doesn't really work. It'll never die.
The thing that I hate about that myth is the phrasing of it. 77 cents to every dollar. It's like you're stating this as if it's an absolute truth to every woman everywhere.
Yeah.
Which, okay, take a woman who works for 40 hours in an office, take a guy who works, compare their pay slips. Just directly compare it. If they're doing all the same stuff, there should be millions of these pay slips that look like this, and yet there aren't. Because every single time you break it down, you remove factor by factor thing. Now, I'm not going to deny that there are small gaps in payment in certain sectors, but it's the fact that so many sectors have no gap at all. There is, once you account for everything in so many sectors, there is no difference at all. There are a few sectors where there is a tiny, tiny gap, and we're talking single-digit percentages. But the problem is that gap goes both ways. In those industries, there are points where women will out-earn men, as we're seeing multiple articles coming out about that now. But then there are certain circumstances where men will earn more than women. It's like, well, why is this a problem? In most cases, there is no gap. And in these cases, the gap is so minute that it goes two ways.
Well, supply and demand, I mean, it's perhaps a poor example to feminists, but, women in the porn industry earn a lot more than men.
Oh, absolutely. But I've never heard them talk about wanting equity there.
No, they never talk about that.
They'll quite happily try and ban the porn industry, though, in some cases, which is like, well, you're going to affect a lot more women than men if you do that.
Absolutely.
Or the worst, I would point out.
A lot of these porn actors.
It's not a very transferable skill.
I saw.
Let's be honest.
It's not just that. I've seen a lot of interesting discussions with porn actresses who are quite brilliant people. And I saw one. She was actually trying to get into physics, and she's using the money she makes in the porn industry to fund her education. So it's the whole supply and demand thing's lost them. But I think this is representative of a general female trend to see. One female represents all womankind, and then vice versa. And so they see a perceived gap, and then they think it applies to them, and then their friend Harriet, and their friend Jane, and just everyone in the neighborhood. I think generally speaking, women have more difficulty seeing things on the macro scale than the micro scale. Obviously, there will be exceptions, but the fact that women so overwhelmingly have embraced this mythology, and it's intoxicating that there's this persistent wage gap and blah blah blah, seems to speak to this. I think.
Yeah, I mean, there is one thing that I would say there. And I don't like this idea of saying that it is just women on aggregate are less likely to understand it. I
Okay.
think it's more down to the fact that they simply haven't necessarily been told it. And then I think in some ways it comes down to trust as well. Who are they going to trust? The president of the United States telling them that that's the case, or some guy on the internet telling them that it's not?
Perhaps, but in my
So I think
experience,
I think there are other elements at play there.
I don't doubt that. But still, this is always using micro examples to somehow disprove or debunk the effects on a macro scale. I've seen this just time and again. It's why I just generally don't even talk about the wage gap anymore, even with my own mother. I mean, I must have spent hours trying to explain this to her, and anyway, it seems a bit futile. But segueing from that, I if you don't mind me asking, what exactly is your political perspective? Because you obviously must have one if you're fighting social justice warriors and what have you.
I have absolutely no idea what
Me too.
my
I don't fucking know.
political leaning is. I
Yeah.
mean, there are some issues where I fall. I mostly lean towards the libertarian camp of things. I like the idea of people being free to do more or less as they please um, within sort of a legal framework. I definitely think that on a lot of cases, I lean towards a sort of minarchist idea, this idea that we need to have a government, but it should be fairly small. But then there are other times when I look at how society's going and I think, you know what? Taking a few pages out of like a National Socialist handbook wouldn't be a terrible idea at the moment just to get shit done.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm
Obviously, ignoring the blatant homophobia and racism.
yeah.
Please, God, ignore that part because that was bullshit.
Well, I've
Some of the economic principles, though, were pretty good.
I've come to the point with just studying philosophy and science. I just don't even know what I'm supposed to believe anymore. And the more I read up on things, the obviously the less I know and the less I think. I just can't even. It's hard for me to even make political judgments. I certainly several years back, 5, 6, 7 years, I would have 7 years. I would have identified myself as a libertarian, but I just find there's so many problems with the philosophy that just don't add up to a factual account of reality sometimes that I just can't go with it. But I'm also not a socialist because I think there are obvious problems with that, and I just don't even have a political. I tend to just step back and not really address politics much because I
Mm,
don't. I could offer an opinion. I could say, well, this would be beneficial, but probably it would just end up being most beneficial to me. I mean, for example, in my case, I don't know what your stance on UK independence from the EU is, but from my own personal, selfish perspective, I wouldn't want that. I've lived in the UK before, and one of the reasons I was able to do that and also pay EU fees is because I'm also a dual citizen of Hungary. If UK left the EU, it might be more problematic, and I've been thinking about doing a PhD in the UK. So I could offer you a perspective on why I think at least labor mobility and study mobility should exist within the EU, but it would be completely selfish for me to say that. I don't know if it's ultimately for society a good idea. Any thoughts?
yeah, I think. Well, I think it's more of a question than a thought. Do you ever feel somewhat like I do on this, where you're so busy trying to seek an objective sort of truth in things or an objective best way that you kind of think I it becomes wrong to offer any sort of opinion.
Yeah,
Like you sort of start
absolutely.
thinking like,
Hmm.
well, I have this opinion, but is it in any way informed, or am I just making this opinion because?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I just offered you an opinion that only benefits me,
Yeah.
and I'm honest about it. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe independence, UK independence from the EU, would benefit, huge swaths of working class Britons,
Yeah. I think
and
there comes a point where if you want to have an opinion on something like this, you do just have to arbitrarily state
Yeah.
what it is. There comes a point where it's just like, no, we just have to make a decision, because otherwise all you're going to do is constantly try and work out which is the right course of action in such a way that you end up never taking action.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, but I have a moderate opinion. It's really the only thing I would keep would be work and study mobility. I don't think, for example, we need a unelected group of magnates in Brussels dictating to the rest of Europe what's going on. But I just don't know. I don't know the answers, and I'm not willing to just rush into a political situation or any situation for that matter with this degree of certitude and say, well, this is the way it's got to be. I just don't know. I tend to stick with things that are observable that I can get from science and what have you. But in some vague sense, for example, I can acknowledge that what maybe some social justice warriors want to do is somewhat noble. It just taken at face value, they want to quote unquote help people out in a bad situation.
Now, that's the appeal of social justice to so many people, that on the surface it is such a noble goal, but when you start digging into it, you uncover, well, as I've just shared, the quite insidious roots of some of it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But
And then you measure that up against history and realize, no, we tried this a couple of times before and millions of people died.
yeah, I don't know if it would at this day and age get to that point. I should hope not, but maybe.
This is why the only way you can know is to do it. But in
Yeah,
doing so, you have to make the decision to do it or not, and you can't objectively prove. So you end up in this situation I find myself in, where you're kind of paralyzed with this: should I just make the decision or not? Is it correct? Only time will tell.
yeah, I feel exactly the same way, especially with regards to politics. I mean, I don't even. I mean, as I said, I'm both European and American. I don't even vote in American elections anymore. I haven't since 2008, and I don't really participate in European politics because it's more or less the same thing. There are differences, but I just don't know. I don't know what's best, and I just try to do my own thing. And I guess I would just describe myself as a seeker after knowledge, and everything else is kind of secondary to me, especially political stuff. And um, I just don't know. I don't know enough, and I think we could actually all benefit from that as a society. And this is once again, this is me projecting what I think, thinking I know. But if many of us took this idea that we just don't know enough and let society sort of just mold itself organically, which it does to a large extent anyway, we might be a lot better off than saying it's this way and we need to change it.
But
But
the question is, if we did that, would anything ever get done? Because someone does have to make the decision at some
yeah,
point.
absolutely.
Such as, let's say, okay, well, let's allow society to mold itself. Okay, well, how much money is the NHS going to get this year?
Yeah,
Someone has to make the definitive statement how many zeros you put on that check.
yeah. I mean, there are things that, yeah, absolutely, that people need to take tough decisions sometimes that may or may not be in accordance with facts. And I get
I think in
questions.
some cases it's just the facts aren't known. We just don't
Yeah,
know enough. And in some cases you have to make a blind decision.
yeah, yeah. I
And then history will judge whether you were right or wrong, usually in some cases too harshly.
a lot of, I mean, there's some things that are pretty clear. I think, for example, the criminal justice system is pretty dysfunctional, especially in the United States, uh, with on so many different levels. But how something that's been in place for such a long time, just as an example, what exactly do we do? I I don't really know. Uh,
Yeah, but how do you change something? Because you can't just tear it all down and rebuild it the
exactly.
next day.
Even if we have a system, let's assume that society at large is predicated on a mass of lies that we've just conveniently believed because it just seemed that way. And one day there's this grand revelation, a scientific one, mind you, and all of that is 99% of that is bullshit. It would be so detrimental to
Yeah,
everyone just to just take a bulldozer and just run over it all and say, well, let's just start from the beginning. I don't.
yeah.
That's why I just don't know what to do when people say, "What are you politically?" I honestly, incidentally, in some circles, I'm known as a socialist and Marxist. I don't really know why they call me that, but just because I might acknowledge that there's an unfairness in life, but I don't know what to do about it, frankly
People
speaking.
love demonizing people, I've noticed.
Well,
Like, even if you're like the most moderate person in the world, as people like us seem to be, it's kind of like, no, I just want objective proof. Someone will always find something. I've had people call me a Marxist. I've had people call me a Nazi. It's like I'm neither of these things.
Well, it's the groupism, right?
Yeah.
It's the team A versus team B. People love people. We're human beings. I think we're biologically inclined to in-group, out-group preferences, things we're familiar
Mm.
with. And if you can't somehow fit into their mold of, and we find this in MGTOW circles with the opposition of, say, traditional conservatives, which is a pretty poor term I've come to acknowledge, but it sort of describes these sort of paleo conservatives who believe women need to be in the kitchen and men need to earn the bacon and be the tough guy and all that. That if they encounter something that doesn't go hand in hand with their philosophy of the world, that's more complicated, it's just leftist Marxist. It doesn't matter if it
Yeah.
has nothing to do with it. It's leftist Marxist.
Yeah, I don't understand that sort of viewpoint. It's like, yeah, there might have been a time where that sort of behavior is necessary for our survival. And if it
Mm.
was for millions of years, then it makes sense that we evolved to facilitate that better. But again, it doesn't make that sort of thing inherently correct.
Well, certainly not in the context of modern
Yeah.
society. But
Yeah. Well, actually, I think of all people I'm going to quote here, Stefan Molyneux, I think, said it right. And he said, like 99% of human history can be boiled down to one sentence: go costume.
go.
My costume is better than your costume.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Of all the things that I think he gets wrong in what he says, I think that one sentence kind of hit the nail on the head for most of humanity.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The clock is right twice a day, as they say.
Precisely.
I'm not a huge fan of Steph. I mean, I've made a video on some of the things I disagree with him
Yeah.
on, but
Like I said, I don't agree with everyone on anything, but that
no.
was one quote that I just heard and thought, yep, that's a pretty good way of summing it up.
It's really impossible to agree with everyone. But I would argue, and maybe I'm wrong in this belief, that if we had a society of people who are seekers after knowledge, who are just interested in the facts and understanding the world, and probably less inclined to draw certain conclusions, we probably would get along a lot better because everyone would be looking for the truth, the facts, and if we made a mistake, we'd say, "Fuck, I don't want to be wrong. Help me, correct me." We would
Mm.
have this sort of mutual interaction that would be beneficial to everyone because everyone would want to be in the factual right, as it were. But maybe I'm just speculating there.
Oh, inevitably, though, their conflict would arise over who thinks they're right.
Well, yeah,
Because one person would have, well, I have this objective proof that proves this, and another person would say, well, I have this objective proof that proves this.
but
And
people
it would
could
be,
use
well,
the
which one do
data.
we believe?
The battle could be fought out by accounting for the data. I mean, if people were actually committed to that as philosophy, if you will, then it wouldn't just be na 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 na. I'm right and you're wrong because of this. That's basically a world where people happily recant their views if the views are found out to be false and incorrect.
Mm.
I don't see that
I,
happening
I think
anytime
the
soon.
battleground for that sort of world would be the soft sciences, though.
Oh,
Things
absolutely.
like sociology and psychology, where there is no absolute truth.
Yeah. Well,
People would find great division there, as
I,
they already do.
I personally, I mean, I've been demonized for this, and I'll tell, I still believe this, that psychology on the whole, I think, should really be composed of two things: evolutionary psychology and neuropsychology, and the rest of it, just get rid of it.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. I have no problem with things like psychology and sociology. It's like, no, by all means, study overarching trends that
hmm.
people show, but don't try and state that those things are going to be absolute truths. This is why when I am of complete agreement when it comes to psychology, the only valid forms of psychology are things like neuroscience and neuropsychology. What is the brain actually doing? What is it objectively, measurably, what are the objective measurable functions that it's performing at this time?
Yeah, although once again, I would argue that evolutionary psychology as it's played, I see it as a branch of evolutionary biology, and a lot of people misunderstand it. But it has predictive power, and it actually works the vast majority of the time. If anything, people tend to misunderstand that it does have a value. It's not evolutionary psychology is not a soft science. It
Mm.
uses it draws heavily upon our past paleontology as well as evolutionary biology. It uses statistics. It's not just sort of people have this idea. Oh, I guess this is what we used to do, so this is why we do this. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But I think the biggest battleground, and I've talked about this before, is in the biological sciences because of all of these issues. I just see sociology as a derivative of this, and psychology. I think evopsych and neuroscience are the best ways of going about it.
Absolutely.
But the physicists generally don't need to worry, but the biologists working on something might need to worry. Anyone who's involved with studying human beings needs to worry. I mean, one of my great concerns that one of the reasons why I'm so vacillating on should I go for a PhD or not is, what if I want to study a subject as someone pursuing, say, evolutionary psychology that is, not PC, that is not in the SJW's dictionary or just not approved. I probably won't even be granted the opportunity to do so. So why should I bother? I think academia in general is incredibly hostile to not even new ideas, but just ideas that, as I described in this professor at the University of Chicago, that may run counter to our quote unquote cherished beliefs. And speaking of
You can't study something that hurts my feelings.
yeah, I mean, I think the late Hitchens said it best. Christopher Hitchens, offense doesn't count as an argument. I'm paraphrasing, but I
No, it's
don't.
true.
Yeah, being offended doesn't. But so many people run off of this software. I just remember most recently my mother, and then years back my mother. Don't say that because you could offend people. Well, of course, there's some room for not offending people. You don't. If your boss has a huge amount of snot hanging out of his nose, you might want to point it out more tactfully rather than just point it out in front of everyone else. I mean, there are reasonable ways of going about it, but when it comes to facts and knowledge, offense, this idea of being offended is just ludicrous. In fact, if that were the criterion for discovery, I mean, we would be still essentially living in caves and not doing a whole lot.
We would, absolutely, because nothing would get done because someone would always find it objectionable.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's a major concern of mine, and maybe I should read up more on intersectionality and all this because I'm just constantly vacillating with the idea: should I just continue doing what I'm doing, or just do something completely different? Is this going to be monetarily a lot more lucrative for me, or should I really try to make a footprint in academia and just push not new ideas, but ideas that have just
The advantage is all of that. Oop, hang on, I think my internet's dropping.
Yep.
Nope.
Okay.
No, I think I'm still
You're good. You're good
internet
for now.
connection problem. No, it's okay.
Okay.
Sorry, there was a bit of a lag there. I wasn't
No.
sure if you were saying anything.
I wasn't. I wanted you to continue actually.
Oh, okay. No, it was just sort of stating that all of that sort of social justice nonsense largely seems to be confined, mostly for now, to the softer sciences. There are elements of it that permeate the harder sciences, or specifically, it's coming into biology. But I don't think that would be a reason to dissuade you from it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Although I'm sure you heard about the Sokol event. That was hysterical back in the '90s. If not, I'd gladly recount.
Oh no, please do.
Okay, so this was hysterical. This was in the '90s. There was a professor of mathematics and physics at the New York University named Alan Sokol, and of course, at the time, all this postmodernist mumbo jumbo was really big. I don't know if it's still big. And as someone who had some background in literature, yeah, back in the day, it was pretty big. And he read up on some of the stuff, and he just said, "Well, this is just nonsense, isn't it?" So he made up this thing, and I don't remember exact title, something like the post hermeneutics of a quantum theory or something. It was just gobbledygook. It was just made up nonsense. And he actually had it published in a comparative literature journal as something authentic. And then a short while later, he revealed that it was just made up garbage and nonsense. And it just, all the people in the postmodernist camp they were just red with they were just embarrassed as hell. And he pointed he said, I did this because I want to see the humanities and the social sciences saved. There's no reason why humanities and the social sciences don't have to be as factual and as rigorous in their approach to things as the hard sciences. Of course, they're treating different subjects, but there's no reason why it has to be just pull shit out of our ass. And as someone who has an extensive background in both the humanities and the social sciences, I mean, it drove me crazy back in the day. I had to listen to all this postmodernist crap. So I thought that really, when he did that, it really resonated with me. But I think I agree with you. There needs to be a renaissance in those fields. I mean, there seem to be two viewpoints when it comes to soft, if you will, soft sciences and particularly the humanities. One is that it's completely useless and a bunch of bullshit. I don't share that. And the other is that we have to go about it the SJW way. Whereas I would just say, the scientific methodology, yeah, it applies to science, but it could apply to everything. A good historian is going to take the data he has. I mean, I don't know, make it up. Let's say he's studying the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1200. He'll take all the data he has, he'll look at the documents, he'll try to create an account of what's going on there without, adding additional things. Of course, he has to interpret it, but I think that branch of human knowledge needs a real, genuine renaissance based on facts and a love of truth rather than just let's pull shit out of our ass, like make things up about quantum physics that we don't even understand, or let's completely jettison the whole project because it's just a waste of time. I don't really find resonance with either side.
No, again, I'm pretty much on that. It's that there is no reason why things like psychology and sociology can't be useful tools. I just think they need to really sort of get their act together and just sort of say, right, what can we objectively prove? By all means, have hypotheses about why certain behaviors are exhibited, but make it abundantly clear, like, this is my theory as to why it is. This is my hypothesis to explain this.
Yeah.
This is my interpretation. Don't push your interpretation as absolute fact.
But I think I'm a bit skeptical that this battle in academia can be won because it seems, by all accounts, that the most entrenched version of social justice warriors and social justice pursuits is to be found there. I mean, we encounter it peripherally on the internet, but that's that's the peripheral. I mean, that's where you really have to go up to bat as it were, to use an American idiom, and deal with this shit. And it doesn't seem to be going away. I mean, even you cited the study, the Cornell study, where it's shown that women applying for jobs in STEM actually have an advantage over men. And when I looked at that video, I'd counted actually prior to that. I mean, they were encouraging them to apply. Say, look, you have this advantage, rather than saying, you see, men don't have an inherent advantage. I got the impression off that video that they wanted to give women even more of a boost than already is present. What was it? Women are twice as likely to get hired for identical positions.
In most things, yes. The only group that they found where there was no difference was the field of economics.
Yeah,
But in
yeah,
all
that's true.
other ones, in all scientific fields, all technology and mathematical fields, women had an advantage, and it peaked at 2 times. So again, to state that it's like twice as much
Okay,
across
didn't
everything
remember
is
the details.
inaccurate, but it drives the point home. It
I
peaked up at
didn't.
2 times the
That's fine.
likelihood.
I didn't know the exact details, but
But I mean, to say that it's between equal to twice as likely. Either way you cut it, no matter how many times, it's still an advantage.
absolutely. And it's always funny that they don't see that as problematic. Whereas if it were demonstrated that men had the same advantage of 0 to 2 times, this would be a huge issue, of course, and they would
Oh, it
point
is.
out
We're seeing
relentlessly.
that with entrance criteria into universities. Those policies that said you must hire, you must ensure equality of income, like for numbers of students. And that law was written, or the rules were written in many universities to be gender neutral. And now that women are getting into universities at higher rates than men, they're instituting the exact same policies to help men. And suddenly, feminists are getting a little bit butthurt about it.
Really?
But these are gender neutral rules. They were written to be gender neutral for this reason, and now they want to get them banned.
Yeah, but we talked about this as well. This drive on the part of some feminists or women to ban salary negotiations based on the fact that men overall tend to be more aggressive at negotiating salary, and to sort of level the playing field, it just shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, that's an absurdity. But
Yeah,
then they try and justify it by saying, "Oh, well, it's a socially conditioned thing. Boys are socially conditioned to be more aggressive for these things. We force them to be breadwinners, and if we did the same for women, it would be okay. Fine, that's your hypothesis. Prove it.
yeah,
Don't just say that that's the case. Don't punish people who are going to push for it. Prove that what you're saying is correct."
yeah. There need to be more studies on this. But Barbarossa made a video a while back where there were several cases of women breadwinners within marriages, and home husbands or homemakers, and how all these women gradually, if not rapidly, lost interest in them, lost respect for them, etc. Of course, it's anecdotal. There need to be more studies, simply because that's the way we evolved. The man who doesn't bring home the bacon. I mean, I hate to use this term, and I don't agree with it. Is essentially a sissy. He is emasculated, and so, and even feminists are. I mean, we see that. Whom do feminists point to all the time? It's always the men at the top, not the bums on the street that they pass by on a daily basis for their commute or whatever.
Absolutely.
They're completely invisible. No, it's or the CEOs. I mean, in the beer video that you made, you pointed this out, and it's I don't know if it. I guess I hate to use this term. Is there hope? Is this insurmountable? All of this feminist propaganda, in one sense, but also the tribalism in an effort just to go after your own particular goals as opposed to facts and knowledge. Do you think that that's defeatable?
I'm not entirely sure. I think in some ways it is because there are people who do chase objective fact. But the people who do that, I think, are quite few and far between. It's a case of how many people can we drag into that, kicking and screaming if necessary.
Hmm.
How many people is it going to take where it's like, no, look at your objective proof. Why do you have your opinion? Do you have objective proof? No, you don't. Then your opinion is wrong, or your opinion is inaccurate, or your opinion is ill-informed.
Yeah, yeah. But so it's kind of a cause without an ultimate end to it, I guess.
Yeah, which I think makes it. I think that's why it seems to be so insurmountable. It's if you don't know your starting point and you don't know your end point, how do you know when you've got there?
Well, maybe I mean it's so cliche and cheesy, right? It's not about the destination; it's about the journey, right? Well, probably it's something along those lines, I guess. At least for me, I have
If it's
no.
the journey, I would rather we go on the road rather than over the mountains that we've been hitting.
Yeah, yeah,
Legs are getting tired.
absolutely. There are too many blockades there. But I think we've talked about a lot of things, and we will then wind this up. Was there anything else that Lord Teal'dir that you wanted to mention that did not get its proper mention?
Not immediately off the top of my head. I'm sure there will be something in a couple of hours when I'm
Well,
thinking about
I
something entirely unrelated to this, but we can, there's no reason why we can't have another conversation
absolutely. I'm
later.
entirely not averse to this. It was a great pleasure and indeed an honor for me to have you speak to me. And I hope the audience, for those of you who don't know Teal'dir, please check out his channel. Of course, he's far larger than I am, so you probably already know him. But yeah, he has some really great material. It's very rigorous, it's very factual, and if you don't know it, please check it out. And if you're, yeah, please just head over there and see it. And I think we're going to wrap that up for here. As always, thank you for watching. This has been a really great MGTOW talk. And as always, may your chosen deity watch over you. Everyone take care, and until the next time, bye-bye.